Oppenheimer, I just know way less about Pittsburgh than Mark.
Well,
No, that's not true.
okay. We get to do that.
That's not true.
All right.
I can't believe you can.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know. I'm sorry about the shields, but that's our excuse for taking the masks off, so please bear with us. Yes, and also, rabbis get nervous about people rushing the stage, so. All right, I have been looking forward to this. This is, by the way, already the largest number we've had for any program, and also we'll have thousands of people watching online. And so it is a great pleasure to welcome you all to what I know will be a fascinating and important program, not only about Squirrel Hill and what happened there, but also about the larger questions that it raises. And we literally could not have a better panel than we do. First of all, Mark Oppenheimer, who wrote the book that you will be buying multiple copies of at the end of the night, and Barry Weiss, who is, I'd like to say, an old friend of Sinai Temple, has been here before and grew up in that community and is able to speak to us not only about the larger questions, but also about Squirrel Hill, even though she modestly said, I know much less about Pittsburgh than Mark does, as I was walking over here. Nonetheless, her lack of knowledge is infinitely greater than most of our plentitude of knowledge. So I will have no hesitation whatsoever in asking them both questions and letting them sort it out. With that, also, those of you who want to ask questions either here or online, there are ways to do so, and our redoubtable program director, Rebecca Small, right over there. Rebecca, please raise your hand. Right next to Chevalier Books, and we thank you, will be handling the questions. And I want to start tonight by asking you, Mark, you have a beautiful description of just what Squirrel Hill is and how unique it is and the kind of neighborhood that all of this took place in. And I think most of us obviously are not familiar with Squirrel Hill. So would you just tell us something about Squirrel Hill?
Sure. Well, first of all, Rabbi and Bari, thank you. And all of you and Chevalier's books, independent booksellers are the true emissaries of the Lord, the true shluchim. So thank you for being here. At some point in this, so thank you all, and thank you for coming out so we can talk about this neighborhood in Pittsburgh where Bari grew up and where my father grew up. At one point in the book, I say something like that my dad grew up in a little Jewish Eden, and I knew that. I knew about it in family legend growing up because my father was he was a fifth-generation Pittsburgher, still is, I guess. I mean, he doesn't live there anymore, but he's alive and well, so he's still a fifth-generation Pittsburgher. And the family had been in Squirrel Hill for 3 generations, which was about as long as anyone had been there, since it really was constituted around the time of World War I, and has been substantively Jewish, about a third or so Jewish ever since, for about 100 years, which is pretty much unparalleled in American history and not very paralleled in world history. And the thing that I say about Squirrel Hill is that it's not only old, but happy and also both internally stable, and I also say Jewishly miscegenated, which is to say that the Orthodox do business with, talk with, are friends with the Reform, and the conservative talk to the Reconstructionists, and the secular talk to the religious. And this is something Bari can talk a lot more about because she grew up there, she lived it. But one of the things that I set out, the question that I brought to this book after the shooting, the 3rd anniversary of which comes up on October 27th, was what did it mean that this terrifying event, the worst anti-Semitic tragedy, slaughter in American history, with 11 dead, what did it mean that it came to one of the best Jewish neighborhoods anywhere? And David Shribman, who was until recently the editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, wrote something about the irony of the fact that the worst anti-Semitic attack came to the least anti-Semitic city in the country, because Pittsburgh has also been just a wonderful place for so many of its ethnic minorities. And so, the fact that Squirrel Hill, which is a mile or 2 square at most, has, within walkable distance, congregations of every denomination, Christian denominations, it has Muslims, it has East Asians, it has public school, library, post office, bookstores, life, all of it walkable, I thought would bring it a certain kind of resilience in the aftermath of the tragedy. And that's what I set out to discover.
So Bari, what was it like growing up in this Eden?
I wouldn't call it Eden necessarily. I would say more like a 21st century shtetl. But one of the things that's incredibly moving and also a little disorienting for me about reading Mark's book is, we all grow up in a context, right? And you just think whatever you grow up with is normal. It's oxygen, it's the water you swim in. You don't think to yourself, hey, it's wet here. It's just normal. And one of the things that's so moving to me about having someone from the outside but kind of from the inside look at it with fresh eyes is, it's kind of, it helped me look at it in a really, really renewed way. So that's one of many compliments that I have for Mark's book. What I'll say is I very much experienced that Jewish miscegenation that Mark talks about inside my own family. It was only later when I went to college in New York that I realized that Jews could fight about things like the height of a mechitza or whether or not 5-inch or 4-inch stilettos were appropriate to wear to Kabbalat Shabbat. In other words, I grew up in a family where it was very normal for us to, have Shabbat dinner, and then the next morning, my sister and I were the youngest Torah readers in our synagogue, and then go to a Chabad family for lunch, and then go to basketball at the JCC. Like, that was all one thing, and it never struck me as, oh wow, in another city, this would be considered unusual because I'm moving between different political and religious denominational lanes. It just never was that way, and I think that's one of the benefits of coming from a place that, as you say, is a few square miles. Like, it's small enough that we don't have, or didn't have, although I still think this is all true, the luxury of sort of constraining ourselves to the lanes that we were born into. And that's one of the things that I think was exceptional about it. The other thing that I'll say that relates more to, I think, one of the important topics of tonight is, was this the least anti-Semitic community in the country? I don't know. What I know is that when anti-Semitic things happened to me, they felt like embarrassing to the people expressing them. So I remember really clearly when I was in 3rd or 4th grade, waiting to go to school at Community Day School, which is the Schechter day school in Pittsburgh. And there was a Catholic school bus that would drive by. And they were screaming things at me and my sister like kikes and dirty Jews. And I was in 3rd or 4th grade. I had never heard that stuff before. And the message from my parents was the opposite of it can happen here. The message of my parents was like, it's so embarrassing that they don't know what this country is about. It's so embarrassing that they don't know what this community is about. Like, you have every right in the wholeness of who you are to have a place in this community and in this country. And anyone that doesn't get that fundamentally doesn't get what America is all about. I think one of the things that has shifted for so many of us after Pittsburgh, but also really because of different sort of seminal events over the past few years, is a kind of questioning about whether or not that remains true. Is it still true that that doesn't represent America? In America that is changing so rapidly, and in America that's moving away, I think, from so many of the things that have made us exceptional. I think it's made all of us, and I imagine so many of us in this room, question whether or not that sort of American mythology that I was raised on right alongside my Judaism still remains true both for us and for everyone in this country.
So I'm going to return to that question in a bit and give you my pet theory about why it couldn't happen here and see what you think about it. But first, I want to talk about what did happen here. And so before we even get to the significance of the event, just tell us what happened.
Sure. On October 27th, 2018, a shooter who somebody was taken into custody that day. He's awaiting trial now, so we should call him the alleged shooter. He's not been convicted, but somebody was caught in the act. Entered Tree of Life Synagogue shortly before 10 a.m., on the corner of Shady and Wilkins Avenues in Pittsburgh. And there were 22 people inside, 21 Jews at worship, or in one case, preparing the lunch afterwards in the kitchen, people doing various things. In another case, preparing a Torah study that was going to happen that morning. But 21 Jews and one non-Jewish custodian, and killed 11 of them and wounded 2 others badly. And several police officers, Pittsburgh police officers who responded, were also injured that day. So there were 11 survivors of the 22 and 11 dead. And this was all happened in about an hour's time. And that set off, and again, the worst anti-Semitic attack in American history. That, and what I talk about in the book is the aftermath. So I should say this, I was not interested in the shooter. This is not a book about the mind of a mass killer. There are good books about that. Dave Cullen's book, Columbine, is a very good book in that genre. And he's a phenomenal journalist. But I was really interested in what came afterwards. So it really starts with that afternoon, how people began to respond that day, and then it set off, there was several days of funerals. Funerals happened Tuesday through Friday. President Trump visited on the first day of funerals, Tuesday, the third day after the shooting. And, there were bodies that had to be laid to rest. There were shivas. It was an extraordinary week. And people, I think, are still feeling the reverberations, but that's what happened.
And before we get to the meat of your book, which is the stories of the people, and as Bari and I were saying to you before, an unbelievable amount of research and interviews and patience and listening was required to lay out all these stories. Before we do that, I'm just curious, were you not interested in the shooter because you didn't think that grand conclusions could be drawn from the actions of one person, or because that just was not your focus? You were interested in how the Jewish community responded to this enormous tragedy.
I mean, partly that I was personally uninterested in spending time getting inside the life and mind of someone who it seems likely was guilty of this extraordinarily evil act. I mean, it was not, journalists, I think, are called to certain questions, and to really go spend a long time investigating a certain question, you have to care in a very deep way. And I didn't care. It wasn't interesting to me. And it seems very likely, based on social media posts that the alleged shooter put up, that he had spent a good deal of time in the depths of white supremacist, bigoted, anti-Semitic, racist, far-right internet swamps. And that was not a place I wanted to spend some time. I didn't think it would be interesting for me. I didn't think it would make me a better husband or dad or friend. It just wasn't what I wanted to do with my life for the next several years. But I was extremely interested in the neighborhood as a protagonist. One of the questions that occurred to me one of the things that occurred to me very quickly was that in this era of mass killings, and there have been extraordinary numbers, dozens and dozens, in fact, hundreds of mass killings, which the FBI defines as 4 or more dead in one episode, since Columbine in 1999. And the vast majority of them are foisted upon random collections of people who happen to be in the same shopping mall that day or the same movie theater, but may live 40 miles apart, strung along different exits off of a freeway, and have otherwise nothing in common except this terrible misfortune. These were people who were together in worship, as the people at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston or at the Sikh temple in Milwaukee were. That's actually the exception. It's the exception that victims of mass killings are people who know each other and care about each other and whose families know about each other. And it just seemed to me that we would learn something special by looking at the aftermath and the community in the aftermath of a killing like that.
So I do want to ask whether the Jewish response was in any sense distinctive from the responses of others, but I think maybe it would be more helpful to ease into that by telling one or two of the stories that you tell in the book that you think are particularly illustrative of the way the community responded.
Sure. Can I just ask, by the way, when were you first there after the shooting?
Sure.
Because her parents still live there.
I got a text the morning that it happened. I was in Arizona. I was supposed to speak the next day and did speak the next day to a major JNF event. It happened to be that I had planned to have dinner with Deborah Lipstadt that night, so it was kind of all perfect in a weird way. And I checked my family group text. It was pinging and pinging and pinging. And the first text just said, there's a shooter at Tree of Life. And my immediate thought went to my dad because, you're talking about Jewish miscegenation. One way that we describe my dad is a promiscuous Jew. And, he pays...
bops from synagogue to synagogue.
Yeah,
right?
he basically hits up the kiddush, at lots of different synagogues. Sorry, Dad, if you're watching. Don't mean to blow your cover. But he's kind of
for those who don't know, that's the lunch afterwards.
Right.
He goes for the food, basically.
Right.
Sorry.
And the schmooze, but and sometimes he'll roll up at 11 to hear the sermon, the drush, but that's who he is. And so he can often be found, as Mark writes about in the book, there were 3 different minyanim that would meet, 3 different services that would meet Shabbat morning at Tree of Life. And it was not unusual for him to be there. Thank God he wasn't there. But I had been I'd been planning to fly to Jerusalem actually that Monday with my dad to do this big reporting trip on the city of David. We ended up doing it 6 months later because of course there was nowhere else I could be other than Pittsburgh. And I flew home and bore witness to the events that Mark opens his book with, and watched as almost in a photo negative that places that were deeply familiar and comfortable and happy became their opposite in a certain sense. The JCC for me was swimming and basketball and plays, and all of a sudden it was Shiva and the FBI and basically a mourning tent. And it was just very strange to witness, neighbors' front lawns. All of a sudden, Anderson Cooper was delivering, the nightly news from there. And I think one of the things that I thought a lot about since then is just how numb I had become to the kind of mass shootings, Mark, that you were referencing before. It's like Las Vegas. Oh yeah, how many people died there? Right. Columbine. Oh yeah, how many people died there? It's like they're statistics. And obviously because of the particular motivations of this shooter, but also because it was people and places that I knew, it was pricked my conscience in this very powerful way and sort of helped me remember how I had stopped being shocked about something that should always remain shocking.
Yeah.
And I just remember that feeling really intensely.
And actually, one of the things, to answer your question, Rabbi, that I noticed is some of the people who were spurred to action, who were kind of shaken from the complacency that I think all of us probably had felt in facing so much news of mass shootings, growing up with them as we did, as Bari and I did. There were people who were moved to action by this, who were not even necessarily Jewish. So some of the stories I tell, for example, I saw in your office you have the hat that says "Stronger Than Hate," and it's the Steelers logo. Some of you can picture this. It's the Steelers logo, but with a Star of David replacing the yellow hypocycloid, a geometric term I learned to write this book. The U.S. Steel and domestic steel logo that was taken by the Pittsburgh Steelers has 3 hypocycloids, red, yellow, and blue, and the yellow one is replaced by a Star of David, and then the legend "Stronger Than Hate" is cut into the side of it, and that was everywhere within 24 hours. It was, people were holding it up at the Steelers game the next day. It was in the shop windows on Forbes and Murray. It's on hats in Rabbi Wolpe's office. It's become iconic. It was created by a German-American lapsed Lutheran graphic designer whom I interviewed for my book named Tim Hindus, who lived in the south suburbs of Pittsburgh. And he was just shocked that afternoon, early afternoon. He was wondering what to do, how he could help. And he thought, well, I'm a graphic designer. I design things. And he was on his Macintosh and just kind of started noodling around and thought, well, Pittsburgh, Steelers, Star of David, and came up with this thing and put it on Facebook, and it kind of went around the world very, very quickly. Someone else who sprang into action that day at little after noon, early afternoon, was an Iranian expatriate named Shai Khatiri, an ex-Iranian, ex-Muslim, aspiring American citizen who's in a graduate program at Johns Hopkins, and was crashing on a friend's sofa in D.C. and woke up that morning, and his friend, who was Jewish, a Jewish woman who was letting him stay there, looked bereft, and he said, "What's wrong?" And she told him about the shooting. He loves the Jews. Many of his mentors in American academia and civic life have been Jewish. He went to a local coffee shop and sat down, opened a GoFundMe page at gofundme.org, and within a week had raised over $1 million for the community. Out of about $7 million that ended up being raised, $1 million of it was raised by this one like 20-something Iranian immigrant. So there were just these like things that happened, and that's not even touching on the Jewish community, but the things that Gentile allies did in the aftermath. And that's part of what I wanted to write about too, is that something like this, there's the killing and there's the killer, but then it sets off these ripple effects, which are just so extraordinary in their own right.
I remember really clearly, and Mark captures these brothers in his book, the brothers David and Cecil Rosenthal, both disabled, both killed. And I remember being at their funeral and watching as, Pittsburgh Steelers were the pallbearers at this funeral. And, there were just dozens of examples like that. And I think one of the things, just to, maybe look at this from 10,000 feet for a minute, is that I think that a lot of times we are feeling lately, the Jewish community, or I'll speak for myself, me, feel deeply, deeply frustrated about, for all of the talk about diversity and inclusion and allyship and all of the rest, the Jews always seem to be extending the hand, but oftentimes the hand doesn't feel like it's been extended to us. And I would say that, that I would say is the experience in the main of American culture right now, for lots of reasons that we can get into. But Pittsburgh was really the opposite of that experience. There was very much a sense that an attack on the Jewish community was an attack on everyone, because in attacking the Jews' right to think differently, to believe differently, to worship differently, it was an attack on anyone's right to exercise that kind of liberty. And so, and there were two things that sort of stuck out to me, and I'm curious, Mark, if there are others. One of them was that in the sort of like big memorial that happened with all of the public officials and the rabbis and the clergy and everyone at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial, is that, what was recited was the mourner's Kaddish, not, some nice but secular thing about mourning the dead. And the other thing was that in the paper that Mark was referencing before, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, that the words, in Hebrew script, but the Aramaic words of the Kaddish were printed on the cover, and you'll remember the date better than me. And I remember seeing that and thinking, hold on, like on the surface, this looks like a pogrom. Like this looks like something that could have happened with different kinds of weapons, of course, in Eastern Europe in the 1900s. But this kind of response is what makes it diametrically different from that kind of attack, because the entire surrounding community isn't standing along as bystanders or, God forbid, participating in it. They're standing up with us, and this is very much what it felt like, and saying, no, by attacking them, you're attacking us.
I should say, by the way, that, that headline, and I talk about that in the book, and I have a picture of that headline, probably the first ever Hebrew script headline in an English language American newspaper. I mean, there certainly were Jewish newspapers that had plenty, and there still are Yiddish newspapers that have plenty of Hebrew script, but this is the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and the editor who made that decision and who asked the graphics department to come up with that headline that said Yit Gadal v'Yit Gadash Shemei Rabbah, the first line of the Kaddish, was David Shribman, who is a Jew, a member of a Squirrel Hill resident, a member of Temple Sinai Sinai Temple, I think it's called. I can't remember if the one in Pittsburgh, it's Temple Sinai, on Forbes. And his daughter just became ordained as a Reform rabbi. And, he had that, but he was a neighbor. He was also a Squirrel Hill resident. And I think that, to me, this, Bari writes, you write so much about national trends, and I have done a lot of that as well. And what was such a pleasure for me was to write a book that felt very, very localist. And so when I think about how the neighborhood reached out, and again, like the municipal officials, the people who back in the Pale of Settlement were rounding up Jews, were against Jews, were sort of worked for the czar, here were the uniformed people were so on the side of the Jews. And I think about the firefighters at 18 Engine on Northumberland Avenue, who were also at that funeral, who came and saluted the caskets and gave a Jewish translation of the Bible to the Rosenthal's parents, and made the dead brothers honorary firefighters. That was actually just the greatest moment of reporting. I had a couple hours to kill, and I thought, well, I'll stop into the firehouse and just talk to some firefighters. And I didn't have an appointment. I didn't know who was going to be there. I didn't know any firefighters in Pittsburgh.
My brother-in-law is one.
Is that right?
Yes.
Is he at 18 Engine?
And a convert to Judaism. Hi, Doug, if you're watching. Yeah.
That's a small community of people, converts to Judaism who are firefighters.
Yeah, it's
Like,
amazing.
There are 6, actually.
That's actually
There
a
are
very
6.
niche. That's a very niche Facebook group. And I popped in. I remember it must have been June because they had the TV on and they were sitting around the table eating the tea. And the French Open was on TV. I saw the clay courts, and I said, "I'm a reporter. I'm just writing about the people who were killed." And Mike DiBattista, who's one of the firefighters, said, "Oh, you sit down. We'll tell you about them." And it turns out he had been very close to David Rosenthal, and he teared up talking about it. And it was just one of those moments of reporting where I thought, so lucky to have the job that I have and to get to know the people I get to know.
So did as a general to both of you, did this in any sense restore your faith or confirm your faith, bolster your faith?
As Jews or as Americans?
As
Or
Americans.
You're on first, babe. It's your book.
I mean, I'm a hopelessly earnest and optimistic person. I'm a patriot. I'm a Jew. I'm a dad. I'm a New Havener. I love all the groups I get to be part of. I love them all, beyond reason. I mean, which actually often brings me into conflict with my friends on the left and the right, who often have so much of the work they do is useful critique, but so often is. And I am a journalist. My job is skepticism, right? And I do have stuff in this book that has upset some people who because I brought a skeptical eye to certain things that happened in the aftermath. But I never. My faith in all of these communities has never really been shaken, but that doesn't necessarily speak well of me. I mean, I think it's not wisdom. It's just temperament. I'm just born that way. You want to take that one?
He was born this way. Yeah, I guess I want to answer that by way of something that happened, I guess, a year later. Everyone here will remember that I think it was the winter of 2019, there was basically a 3 or 4 week period where it felt like there was a violent attack on Jews almost every day. And several of them came during Hanukkah. You'll remember the guy with the machete, deranged person who walked into the rabbi's home. And this really was a scene out of The Tale of Settlements.
In Muncie, New York,
Yeah, in Muncie, New York, upstate New York, a 90-minute drive from Times Square, and walked in with a machete and hacked at people. And one of them, Joseph Newman, ended up dying a few weeks later. There was another incident within weeks of this at the kosher supermarket in New Jersey, in which Black Hebrew Israelites, they had plans to really bomb the place to smithereens, but it ended up that they murdered 4 people. Anyway, there was a bunch of these instances, and of course the sort of rolling attacks taking place against the most visible people in our community, the Haredi Jews of places like Crown Heights and Borough Park. And I remember I wrote a column for the New York Times about it called America's Bloody Hanukkah, and it never ran. And the reason it never ran is because the identities of the perpetrators were not morally convenient to this worldview. In other words, when the people that attack Jews in this country are tiki torch wielding, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, Robert Bowers type, that's the name of the alleged Pittsburgh shooter, I guess we should say, there's moral clarity. Everyone knows what the right thing to say is. Everyone is clear about what good is and what evil is. And yet somehow when people that murder Jews come from groups that have been deemed perma-victims in some sense, it's impossible then to see them as also capable of being victimizers and indeed capable of carrying out great evil. And I think one of the things that has shaken me is not the fact that terrible violence is possible in this country, or that people can get drawn into the darkest corners of the web, or to fringe conspiracy theories that have us as the kind of evil puppet master. None of that strikes me as new or different, although maybe more extreme, maybe more people getting drawn to it, and certainly polarization and extremism and the algorithm and all those things that you already know contributing to it becoming more mainstream. I think what has shaken me is the silence and the papering over or the justification of deeply mainstream anti-Semitism from the corners of our culture that are meant to be high-minded and sophisticated and savvy and intellectual. And that, to me,
I agree. No, I agree.
That has shaken me.
I agree. I have a somewhat different angle that I take when I talk about that, but God, now you're bringing me down. I'm like the cheery optimist, and you're pointing out bad stuff. But no, thank you for bringing that up. And one of the other things going on there, I think you would agree, is that there's the perpetrators, but there's also the fact that the victims were Haredi in a lot of these cases, were black-hatted Jews. And
Exactly. Yes, thank you for pointing
to a lot
that
of
out.
secular Jews, secular Protestants, secular Catholics, secular Americans, to a lot of people who are irreligious or in liberal religion, the ultra-Orthodox, to use a term that's problematic because ultra does sound demeaning, and a lot of people who are themselves highly observant in that way do not like the term ultra, but will use it. The ultra-Orthodox seem exotic and problematic, and they figure that there's always something wrong with them. Either it's that they voted for Trump in numbers that were too great, or it's that they're not vaccinating in numbers that are too great. And it's not that these critiques are untrue or wrong, but what I want to point to is the way that before Trump or vaccines, there was always something that about the ultra-Orthodox that to high-minded, more secular people, that is to say people who worship and think and are educated more like me and Bari, in fact, and Rabbi, right, that made them problematic and outside the circle of concern.
Yes.
And I, when people say, where's anti-Semitism in America? Well, anti-Semitism is exceedingly low if you walk down the street passing, as we do. And, there aren't many country clubs that still have barriers. I'm sure there are some, but there aren't many law firms that won't make us partner anymore. I mean, the signs of anti-Semitism that we talked about 50 and 60 years ago are largely vanished.
Well, they're
But-
different.
But the anti-Semitism toward people who wear black hats or women who wear wigs who are visibly Jewish they know it's very much alive. They still get yelled at from passing cars. So it's like,
Yeah, I agree with everything Mark just said. I would only say that the test is now different. Try being an open Zionist and getting a job at tons of fancy places that all of us are thinking about in our heads right now. Try and be an open Zionist on many American college campuses. It's just, let's just even think about this week. Sally Rooney, one of the most celebrated.
Oh, I was so sad. I had just finished her book.
Was it good? I
literally
haven't read
just
it.
finished her book, thought it was wonderful, read that, and thought, now.
do you want to tell everyone what happened?
Yes,
Yes,
Sally
guys.
Rooney, beloved Irish novelist. She wrote the book Normal People.
Haven't read it.
She
David,
just
what's her
published
most
her
recent
third.
book?
She just published her third novel called Beautiful World, Where Are You? And I have to say, previous to discovering what Barry is about to talk about, I thought all three of her books were fantastic explorations of human interaction, of modern male-female relationships, so on. She's a brilliant novelist. And then a day or two ago, what did I find out, Barry?
Well, you found out that she won't allow her most recent novel to be translated into Hebrew because Israel.
But she won't allow it to be translated by an Israeli publisher. She says she
Right.
welcomes a Hebrew translation by a non-Israeli publisher if
Yeah.
someone can be found.
Okay, that must have been like a subsequent
It was
press release.
subsequent
just to be
clarification.
precise.
Today in Haaretz, she said that. She said as long as it's in conformity with BDS, and also, by the way, Ireland is not a friendly country in terms of like surveys of anti-Semitic attitudes. So that's against that background as well. But go ahead.
No, the only thing I would say is that, the test is no longer quotas, right? The test is, are you allowed to be a Jew and a Zionist proudly? Are you accepted without having to disavow Jewish power? Okay? That's the test now. And increasingly, in order to be included in the community of the righteous, or what you call the circle of concern, you need to disavow an increasing number of things that are core to our identity. And that is anti-Semitic, period. And it just presents itself in a much more subtle, in a far less obviously lethal way than a mass shooting. But it doesn't make it less important, I think, to talk about. Because frankly, that's the kind of anti-Semitism that most of us, most of our kids, most of our families are going to actually encounter in our daily lives.
So let's pursue this question for a minute and as the academics put it, complicate this picture.
No, the academics say problematize.
Yes,
You
problematize.
meant problematize.
Is that actually a real word?
Complexify. Yes, problematize, complexify. I don't want to privilege complexify over. But anyway, so on the one hand, Jews consistently come out as the most admired group, although that admiration can be double-edged, clearly. On the other hand, it is true, especially increasingly in elite institutions, paradoxically, that exactly what you say has been taking hold. Universities, some corporations, other places. So I wonder what you think of, here's the theory that I've been propounding for 20 years. I wonder if it still holds any water. I used to, when people would say that it can't happen here, or it can happen here, my argument was that the reason that America was different was that in every place that Jews have dwelt, they have been the identifiable other. There were Russians and Jews, there were Poles and Jews, there were Germans and Jews. In America, there aren't Americans and Jews. There are many, many different groups, and there are different identifiable others. And I always thought that that was some level of protection. I wonder if you think that that protection is breaking down.
I do. And the reason for that is because of an identity politics that's rising on the right and on the left that is being increasingly accepted. And on the right, we know what it looks like. It's blood and soil nationalism. It's these are the white Americans, these are the pretend Americans, you know, and the Jews, in a sense, are the greatest trick the devil has ever played because they appear to be white, but in fact, they're loyal to, in the case of Tree of Life, immigrants. What's going on the left is the idea that, no, actually, we're not all equally Americans. We're not. What we are locked into a kind of zero-sum identity politics. I haven't seen this yet, but I hope this reference is right. Squid Game type survival type show where, you know, you get certain points if depending on where you sit on the spectrum of gender.
So how do you explain the reaction? How do you explain the reaction to Tree of Life? Given that.
Let me give you one example that this is where this could go. When I think this is what could happen here, I don't think Holocaust. I think soft core version of what happened in the Soviet Union. I was with a writer the other night, and she said to me, "You're not going to believe this. Maybe you will, but you're not going to believe this." I was like, "What?" And she was like, "Look at this lineup of the people in the writer's room that I'm in. If you were a person of color, you got an asterisk by your name. If you were LGBT, you got a little cross. But if you were Jewish or white, you got nothing at all." Now, I don't know first of all, I don't know if that's legal. But the fact that this has become something totally normalized.
You mean like over their heads? Or like, no, literally, I don't even understand what you mean.
Like on a piece of paper.
On a piece of paper.
So you get this.
So they handed out a list
look, Barry, you and I were at the home of a producer who explained that that's how he has to cast, right?
Correct.
He has to check off every single, and Jewish is not one of the boxes, but he has to check off all these boxes, and in fact, it's like a very rigid sort of caste system.
Yes, and again, like, you know, you don't need to go to the worst examples in history to look at that and say, there's something fundamentally un-American about that, and if that becomes normalized throughout the culture, throughout the institutions that are the sense-making institutions of American life, that's something we should be alarmed by.
You know, so I'm actually not a big picture theorizer. Increasingly, I've realized, like, the older I get, the less I think I know, and therefore the more I want to report. And this book was really clarifying for me that way, because it absolved me of the need to speak, because I got to be I got to let these people speak through me. And one of the things that was really interesting, and I don't know if this complicates or problematizes what you're both saying. It may not.
Let's problematize
is that they are in the lingo of some of my friends, they're normies, right? Like they're, you know, the people I was talking to in Pittsburgh were generally not aware. It's not that they weren't intellectuals. It's just that they were in the Midwest, and I wasn't by and large talking to professors. And I would say, by the way, the exact same thing. I mean, I have a test that I run. I live on a street in New Haven called West Rock Avenue. It's my house is worth about $365,000. It's 4 bedrooms. I have 2 dogs and 5 kids, and we do fine. And the guy across the street is a firefighter. There's a retired woman next door to me. There's an engineer the other side, a couple houses down. There's a computer programmer. I mean, it's educated, probably 95% Obama voting, but not on media, Twitter, and not obsessed with culture war stuff. And I often try to run the test when I write something of, would this make sense to my neighbors? By the way, some of whom are substantially brighter than I am. I mean, the ones who are engineers or computer programmers do things I could never do. And some of them, by the way, are journalists, in one case in local reporting. But I think I'm the only person on the street who does, flies around reporting stuff and gets to talk to people in Los Angeles, right? And I run the test of, does what I'm saying make any sense to the people on West Rock Avenue or to my parents? My dad went to Yale. He's a super educated guy. And, when I was growing up, he got the Springfield Daily News in Springfield, Massachusetts, and not the New York Times, and NPR still played classical music, right? And our news diet was who's running for city council in Springfield, Massachusetts. And that's most of America. Less so because local media is disappearing, and so everyone just tunes into national stuff and gets fed by Fox News or NPR or whatever. But I actually think that a lot of these debates, it's not that you're wrong about what's happening at elite levels. I certainly see it in academia where I teach part-time. But I also see the extraordinary fund of goodness and sanity when you talk to people who have other kinds of jobs and other kinds of responsibilities. And so I think that probably nurtures my optimism a bit more.
Barry, we have a ringer here. What are we going to do with him? I mean, he's... I think that's quite a wonderful perspective for us who do absolutely sometimes over-engage in these debates that are on media and are in universities.
I mean, you live in California. We all know California is crazy.
Yes.
California, out there in New England, we think you're crazy.
Yes, well.
Would you be sitting in plexiglass in a...
No.
No shade. Love Sinai.
Hey, listen, we hear what's going on at Yale. So that's also crazy.
We've got crazy too.
But okay, before one more question, and then I'd like to open it up for those of you who are here to ask questions if you like, which is, I know that this shooter spent a lot of time on the internet.
Something called Gab, which I didn't know existed. Did you know about Gab, before him?
Well,
maybe I had heard of it, but I never had
Some
looked
like
at
this
it.
far-right website.
Here's what I want to know is, I know you don't engage in the big questions, but for both of you, I think that you focused on the big question you can answer, which is what was special in the response of the Jewish community. I'd like you to address both that and also, can we learn societal lessons from the actions of one evil person?
No, I don't think we can learn anything from his actions, but I think we can learn actions from the response. I mean,
So
look, ultimately, if we know anything about statistics, even with several hundred mass shootings in a country of 300 million people, that's a tiny sample size. It's not statistically significant. Most of us are overwhelmingly safe all the time from white supremacist shooting. That's just the way it is. And we see this stuff on the news and it makes us overly scared. But I was not in favor of increased security at my synagogue when it was my turn to talk on the board at the board meeting.
Really? Say more about that, because we walked in.
Because the odds that any of us are going to get shot are really low.
I mean,
They're just low. And security is an ideology, as it is with COVID. I mean, we can all be perfectly safe. Franco's Spain was no one robbed anyone in Franco's Spain or Mussolini's Italy because they knew the cost you'd pay. Like, you can get a perfectly safe world. And sometimes the right wants a perfectly safe world, and sometimes the left does. But we live with insecurity. I mean, you can I know people who put helmets on their kids to drive them in the car.
this is a great column, by the way.
I know parents who don't let their kids. Sorry, now I'm on the soapbox.
Oh, I love it.
I know parents who don't let their kids use jungle gyms. I mean, you can be perfectly safe. Life's no fun when you are. But here's the thing, right? You also can't have Judaism like that, because Judaism actually has to happen in person, because there's a reason that we say you need to pray with 10 people, because there's a reason that the prayers after the meal require 3. I mean, we were built to be socially, it's a technology, I hate using that word, but it is a technology for bringing people together. And that's not to say that you don't make sane adjustments in times of pandemic or pogrom, but the reality is that these people, one reason there was some resilience in Squirrel Hill is because they lived near each other, they knew each other, and they got hugs from each other in the Giant Eagle supermarket and in the bookstore and in the post office and at Alderdice High School. Like, because they had neighborhood institutions where they kept bumping into each other. And I think that if this had happened during COVID, when people went back to their houses and just kept locking down, there would have been substantially more depression and unresolved trauma.
Can I
feel
rephrase?
like you've been reading Liel, and I'm loving it.
I just want to rephrase what you said, if I may, which is come to this Shabbat morning services in person, please, because we will be here.
No. To be clear, I think that sane vaccine and distancing regimes are sane. What I don't think is sane is the mindset of always trying to maximize security in any area of life, because you can do that, but then you never leave the house at any time, pandemic or not, and then you don't have Judaism.
No, Mark, I'm paying a compliment. I think it's a really important message to be putting out into the world right now, when it seems like once we lock down, it's become extremely hard, at least for segments of the community, to ever reverse course on that.
There is an actual psychological syndrome that they face when someone is holding onto a ledge and help comes. They have a hard time getting people sometimes to let go of the ledge in order to pull them up. And it goes back to firefighters again. And there is something about when you've achieved some kind of safety in the face of a danger, to then let go of those safety mechanisms is not easy. And it takes time and coaxing and exactly the realizations that you're talking about. So,
this is sort of related, but I just really want to recommend it to everyone. There's I hope it goes viral. This is my effort to make it go viral. It has not gone viral. There is a video, an advertisement for tactical, what's the garb that Haredi men wear that's black? Kapata?
yeah, a kapata.
Okay, it's called a tactical kapata. I tweeted it today. And it's literally, I'm serious, I'm not kidding. It opens and you see a guy wearing a kapata studying in Beit Midrash or a synagogue. And you hear, this is post-Pittsburgh dystopia, okay? And you hear the sounds of shooting and screaming. And you watch as, because he's wearing not a regular kapata, but a tactical kapata, that he is able to, unleash his gun within seconds and go and kill the shooter. And then it says at the end, tactical kapatas, Shaul, whatever. And I'm like, what universe am I living in? No, it's not a joke at all. It's completely real. He also sells just high-end normal kapatas if you're in the market for that. But watching this, I was like, what universe am I living in?
You should know, so that you wouldn't imagine that this is a totally modern phenomenon. I really mean this. In, I believe, the 1950s, maybe Rabbi Sherman might know better, Morris Adler, who was a rabbi in Detroit, was actually knifed and killed by a schizophrenic person that he had been counseling, okay? This synagogue, which was built in the aftermath of that in the 60s, they put bulletproof bima, the rabbi's, whatever it's called, thing, not this, but is bulletproof. And so the idea, one bad thing causing a chain of overreaction of safety is not a new phenomenon. I think it's sort of built into our animalistic DNA.
Yeah, and again, it's not. Yeah,
well,
I want to hear their questions.
Wait, but
Yes,
Mark,
me too.
just to tie that back to Pittsburgh. Oh, sorry.
No,
Rebecca,
tie it back to Pittsburgh.
I was simply going to ask Mark,
Yeah, go ahead.
Tree of Life never reopened.
Raise your hand, by the way, if you have a question, and Mike Americano will come by with the...
I was simply going to ask him, Tree of Life never reopened, unlike so many of the other places, Temple, Mother Emanuel, or think about Poway. That opened 2 weeks later. I stood in that synagogue. There were still bullet holes.
Yep.
It opened. What do you make of the fact that at least Tree of Life sort of seemed frozen in place after that event? And what does that say to maybe problematize or complicate the narrative that you told us about Squirrel Hill?
Yeah, I don't, that's a great point. And the book deals with these tensions as well. And there's some tension around what becomes of the Tree of Life building. It actually would be it needs renovation. There are bullet holes, there are blood stains. If you renovate, you have to bring it up to code. It's a very old building. I think there would be handicap accessibility issues. There need to be several millions more raised to do the kind of renovation they now want to do. And there was also a lot of discussion about what kind of renovation that is. So some people said we should go right back in and pray in the exact same space where the people were shot down. Like that's how you sort of give your middle finger to the terrorists, right? Is you go right back in and use the space. Other people said I could never joyfully pray there again because it was the site of my friend's death. And those are both totally valid positions. And those positions were in opposition. And the community did a lot of listening and a lot of thinking, and took a very long time to do it, probably longer than some communities would have, and ultimately decided they're going to keep the building but renovate the interior, and it'll be some sort of combination museum, memorial, education center, and worship space. I think this will be several years off. I think will require raising a lot more money, and there is dissension within the community about whether this is a good use of the space, given that there were only a couple or several dozens of people using it for worship on a given weekend. Anyway, it was not one of the busier worship spaces in Squirrel Hill. So look, it's not that everything is totally Edenic or Irenic there. There are tensions, there are disagreements, but they were handled civilly. They were handled as people who loved each other and as friends and neighbors. And I think that's kind of the lesson.
All right, questions? There's a question over here from Alan. Alan, while Mike's making his way over to you, we have a question from YouTube, which is, what should Jews do? Historically, the person said, public opinion swings like a pendulum. It may take time, but ultimately things change. What can we do to move the needle? So that's one thing to think about. And
why don't you take that one? I mean, you've been in communal life longer than either of us.
I think that this is a particularly difficult time to move the needle because people seem very fixed. And everything, this is the only time in my life that every question has ultimately resolved itself to politics. And that makes it very difficult for people of different persuasions to meet in the middle on questions and agree that it's not actually a political question. There's this beautiful quote, I think it's from either Tennyson or Samuel Johnson, about of all things that we have to endure, very little can kings or laws cause or cure. And I think that idea that politics is actually not what makes life worth meaning, that's the swing that we have to accomplish first. Yeah. Because as soon as it gets hardened into a political position, and it does, if you say I'm anti-racist, that's a political position. It's not a human position. If you say I'm against anti-Semitism, a lot of people read that as a political position, not a human position. As long as that's true, it's going to be really difficult to meet somewhere.
I agree. I mean, I do want to say, listening to all this, like, I have been keenly aware of left-wing anti-Semitism. I've written about it. By and large, in America, left-wing anti-Semitism is not murderous. And the reality is I don't need people to like me, but I need them not to kill me. So I am much more concerned about right-wing anti-Semitism. I mean, the violence, the gun stockpiling, that's a right-wing phenomenon in America. And I trust that my children will walk proudly as Jews, and whatever their relationship to Israel is, that they'll carry it honestly and forthrightly. And I talk with my kids about this. And they'll suffer whatever glares they need to suffer, but I need them not to be killed. And I do think that this sort of, on the one hand, on the other hand, is a bit disingenuous, because there's no left-wing group that we know of stockpiling guns that we are worried about coming for Jews right now. And there are groups in America that are on the right that are doing that. And we have to be mindful of that. I mean, that's you know, reality is that which we're not at liberty to ignore, as the philosophers say. And that's reality. So that worries me much. I mean, the reason you have guards out there is not because of BDS. The reason you have guards out there is because of right-wing anti-immigrant anti-Semites.
Well, let me.
Yes?
No, I'll tell you why.
It's because of campus radicals?
I'll tell you, wait. No. Hold on.
Yeah.
There is an Islamic anti-Semitism that is also capable of violence. And that's not a right-wing anti-Semitism. And that actually...
No, fair enough.
And that actually, unfortunately, I mean, again and again, we've seen you do have to be concerned about. So there is that as well. And look, half this congregation comes from Iran, from the Middle East. And they can speak to that, I think, with eloquence and personal experience.
Yeah, no question.
So there, I wanted to complicate the question.
You know why you have your guards better than I do. I shouldn't wade into that.
Well, no, but I mean, you're certainly right.
It's not because of assistant professors at Yale that you have guards.
No, you are certainly right about the violence as opposed to the ideological anti-Semitism. However, you could make an argument. I really don't want to take a political position on this, but you could make an argument that ideological anti-Semitism is ultimately more pervasive and could be more destructive in the long run, even if it's not immediately weaponized in the short run.
Yeah, it's corrosive in its own way.
No, but Mark,
It's corrosive in its way. I'm just less.
Mark, you just said before that the number of, you basically said that in a sense, there's probably been an overcorrection. I think I would agree with you on this in the hardening of Jewish spaces in America, given the fact that if we actually look at how many active shooters there are and how many active shooters that target Jews, it's microscopic still in this country. When P. Diddy hosts Louis Farrakhan to give a July 4th day address to reach tens of millions of people on Revolt TV, you're telling me that that is not enormously concerning to you? When Tamika Mallory is in a ad for Cadillac, it's just like this is normalized. No one cares about that.
I'm well aware that lots of teenagers get their thoughts on Israel from Twitter and from celebrities on Twitter.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about
with you.
I was agreeing with you. No, but you're diminishing it.
No, I'm not diminishing it.
You are.
I was saying that I think we just have to, our job as intellectuals is to be precise about these things. And I'm worried about safety because of a different phenomenon than P. Diddy, who, by the way, I didn't know anyone talked about anymore.
Well,
I didn't know about that. I'm not on social media, and I didn't know that it happened. But I'm well aware of the anti-immigrant violence that I just reported on for 3 years in your neighborhood.
Yeah, no one's disagreeing about the fact that the reason that if someone, God forbid, was going to walk in here with an AK-47, that person 9 times out of 10 would probably be from the political right. I'm always confused though about why it needs to be like an either or, choose a side, choose which one is worse.
That's why it gets politicized. And I agree, it doesn't have to be. By the way, this is a good time to tell you not only to buy Mark's book, but also later on to buy How to Fight Anti-Semitism by Bari Weiss. Okay, Alan.
So the question I actually had for Bari, but it was on that. And
a little louder, we can't hear.
Can I bring this down for a second?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you. And it ties to what Mark was just saying, but my kids are applying, one of my kids, she's applying for high school, and she's filling out her high school applications for some of the schools you've written about, which I've read many of your articles. And one of the things I told her is, politics is nowhere to be found in anything you say. You just go around with whatever the cultural norm, but Judaism is your identity, to what you were talking about earlier, Bari. And one of the questions on these apps that is a common question across all of them is, what is the most important part of your week? And she struggled because she wanted to say Shabbat because she sees her family every single week, and she didn't want to put that she was Jewish on the application. And we did. And I said, you stand for your identity. Politics is not your identity, but Judaism is, and you have to stand proud of that and not let that put you down. And it also ties to what Mark is saying right now, which I disagree with. Sure, shooting a gun at someone is what kills them, but people don't realize that the whole purpose of cancel culture is career death, to ruin someone's livelihood, which may not be they're in a funeral, but if I'm a physician and I get pushed out, I am a physician, and I get pushed out of the hospital I work at, in my career that I spent 12 years of medical school and residency and it is ruined, that is the death of a major portion of my life. And though it may not be a gun, it is the death of my identity in a major way. And so to poo-poo that just because they're not shooting on the left, but then they will go around and make kids scared to apply for school and to say who they are, or that it could affect their career, I think is a big mistake, and it limits and it diminishes how negative it has become as a problem in the society, where my 8th grader is scared to say she is Jewish in her high school application because that may negatively affect her ability to get in.
Okay. All right. Okay, so a question. Just talk.
Just talk. I'm a native of Pittsburgh and a graduate of Alderdice, and my great-grandfather, who was the son of Rabbi Salanter, was one of the founders of Trio Life when it was in Oakland. it was the first conservative temple in Pittsburgh. And of course, the conservative movement has a large history in Pittsburgh. But it only moved to its present location in the mid-50s, actually. It was where the Pittsburgh Playhouse was before. And when I was young, there was still a lot of anti-Semitism, I'm older than you, in Pittsburgh, particularly in Alderdice, among the Catholics who came from the Hill and places like that. Sons of the Steelworkers, Sandy Weinstein, another member of Temple Sinai, whose family owned the major deli in Pittsburgh, Weinstein's. And the worst anti-violent mechanism I had was I used to take violin lessons at the Irene Kaufman Center, which is you refer to as the JCC, on Saturday afternoons. And I would walk there from my home on Beechwood Boulevard carrying a violin case. And I was frequently stoned in front of Shara Torah by the ultra-Orthodox. That was the most violent thing that happened to me.
Jewish on Jewish violence.
Right.
Right. So
this is still a problem in the world, and particularly in Israel.
Okay, I don't want, I mean, you're right.
Yeah.
It's an important issue. I don't want to get onto Jewish and Jewish violence in Israel. Let's stick with non-Jewish on Jewish violence in Pittsburgh. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So in your experience in Pittsburgh, I was bar mitzvahed at Tree of Life, as you were bar mitzvahed at Tree of Life. Did you have feeling that it was interesting, that neighborhood itself was on the edge of Squirrel Hill, and where Tree of Life is presently.
So what are you asking?
So
Whether
I'm
she
asking-
experienced anti-Semitism growing up?
Yeah.
Or did you experience anti-Semitism growing up or prejudice from other Jews?
From other Jews.
Basically, no. Basically, no. Things happened. I mentioned the Catholic school bus earlier. By the way, all four of my grandparents went to Alderdice. My parents went to Alderdice. They were high school sweethearts from Alderdice, so I have a lot of affection for Alderdice. But
You literally wouldn't be here, but
yeah, literally. I was conceived at Alderdice. No, I wasn't. But basically, thank God I didn't have the same experience that you did, especially inside the Jewish community.
Yes, go ahead.
Mark,
yes.
with all due respect.
No,
Yes.
question. A question.
Yes,
It
what's
is
the
a
question?
It is a
ahead.
question. And let me just preface this by saying I'm fiercely independent, so I'm not here to vilify or aggrandize either side. But most, I think you would agree, of the anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiment is coming from the left and not just the far left. Seeing as so many people are hell-bent on the destruction of the state of Israel right now, where do you see the future of Judaism in a world that no longer supports, and maybe even where America pulls away all
Okay,
support
do you want to
from
take
Israel?
a global question of the destruction?
Yeah,
What do you see?
I mean, I think the first thing I would say is I've spent, I spent 18 months and 32 trips going to Squirrel Hill, and I'm not.
You better run for mayor after all of that.
Exactly,
I've been to Israel twice, and I'm not. It's not something I write about because I don't know enough. Now that said, I think there's some problematic assumptions baked into your question. Of course, there was a thriving Judaism before the state of Israel. The Reform movement used to be anti-Zionist. The most Haredim used to be anti-Zionist. And today, for good reasons, that's no longer the case and no longer tenable. I personally support a two-state solution, and I support a safe and secure Israel. But I don't know that analytically it follows that the way to track anti-Semitism is to track anti-Zionism. They are definitely commingled, but they're also different, and not all anti-Zionists are anti-Semites, and there's some anti-Semites who have no particular interest in Israel. The job of writers and thinkers about this is just to be as precise as possible. That's not the job of activists. It's not the job of fundraisers, but it's the job of writers. The job of writers is to not oversimplify and to be as precise as possible. So when I write about things, I go in and try to interview as many people as I can and talk to people who know more than I do and learn something about it. The book has very little to do with Israel. I will say this for you, though. I completely agree with you that that right now there's much more public anti-Zionism coming from left liberals than there is from the right in our current discourse. That is true, and that's worth analyzing and thinking about. So I think that you name something that's true.
But just to piggyback on that question, was your sense, having spent, again, like he knows much more about my community than I do, was your sense among the people that survived it and you know, there's so much reporting in this book, it's incredible to me. Was your sense from them in the aftermath of this, to make it particular and specific and local, that this event fundamentally shook their faith about their place as Jews in this country and the future of Judaism?
No, I mean, what's so interesting, right, is the people I was talking to were not asking, first of all, nobody talked to me about Israel in the aftermath of this. And I mean, this is one of the things I want to make clear, is that the work that they were doing, going to the shivas and cooking for each other and trying to make a minyan when, 11 minyan makers have been killed, the work that they were doing was not Zionist work or anti-Zionist work. The work they were doing was kahila, was communal Judaism, which can be done anywhere in the universe. And I just really want to ground it in what these people were doing, which was not for them, and it's like what you were saying, these are not political acts. They are Jewish acts that don't map onto the left, right, and some of them, by the way, I think are politically left, and some of them are more conservative. I never asked whom did you vote for. And by the way, they have different positions within the families, within, say, the survivor group of those who lost relatives. Of the 11 who died, when you look at their families, I know there were different positions on the extent to which gun control is implicated in this. I have a whole chapter in here about the disagreement about whether, at the one-year memorial, anyone should talk about gun laws. Because some people felt it would be un-Jewish not to talk about gun laws. How do you honor the dead without talking about the incredible ease with which people get guns, especially in Pennsylvania, which has extremely liberal gun laws, by the way, which has Alabama-like gun laws, or as someone told me. I haven't actually read the statutes myself, right? So some felt the only Jewish thing to do if you care about these people is to talk about gun control at the one-year memorial. And then there were people who said, whatever you do, do not politicize the death of my loved one. Do not talk about politics. I find both of those to be deeply felt, authentic responses to the loss of a loved one. They're incompatible, but they're both deeply felt and human. And that's the kind of thing I wrote about.
I'm curious about, when the pandemic hit, how did that affect the community?
I didn't have to think about it because my last reporting trip was in mid-March of 2020, and it was planned that way. What I would do is I would look for really cheap tickets so I live between basically Logan in Boston and LaGuardia, about an hour and 20 minutes from one, about 2 hours from another. And you can't fly direct from New Haven or Hartford. So I had to get up at about 3:30 in the morning and drive to one of those two places and fly direct to Pittsburgh, report all day, and fly home. When the shooting happened, I had a 2-month-old son. And I wasn't going to be gone more than 1 or 2 days a week. And my wife was extraordinarily supportive, and so were my other children in helping to take care of the baby. But I really had to fly in and out on the same day. So I would look for where you could get $90 or $100 tickets a couple months in advance, and I'd buy a bunch of them. And the last batch I bought, and I said to my wife, this is the last batch. I'll have been going for 18 months. I bought tickets number 29, 30, 31, and 32. I did 32 trips. The last trip I made was something like March 12th or 15th or something, right as COVID was descending. And I flew in on a flight that was about half full, and I flew back on a flight a day or two later that had 4 other people on it. So that was already planned to be the end of my reporting. And it is interesting to ask how they have processed and dealt during COVID. But honestly, I haven't done that reporting, and I just try to limit myself to the stuff I've really reported out well.
So one other question that a rabbi has to ask you, which is, we've talked politics, we've talked community, we've talked anti-Semitism, we haven't talked theology. How did people feel theologically about God, about Judaism in the wake of such a tragedy?
Well, I asked that question sometimes, though generally I just asked people what was on their mind, and I just had conversations. But it won't surprise you as a rabbi that they very seldom went to theology, because really, Judaism, as you know, the act does precede the thought, right? And so what they were so interested in was first the 7 days of Shiva, and then the 30 days of Shloshim, and then the 11 months or 12 months, however you hold it, of mourning until the yard site. And so, people almost never talked theology to me, except, you know, they would do acts that were incredibly theologically beautiful. I mean, there was someone who started dressing up more in honor of Mel Wax, who was killed, who always dressed for shul. And there was someone who said, so I dress for him. There was someone who every time he mentioned the name of one of the dead said, Zichronom Livraham, you know, may their memory be for blessing. And so he'd be talking about 3 or 4 people in one sentence and be like, so-and-so Zichronom Livraham, and so-and-so Zichronom Livraham. And it was like, and then I finally realized, like, this takes a long time for him to get his thoughts out, but it's so gorgeous, the ideas behind it. So there was religiosity, but I wouldn't say there was theology.
I would just only share a memory that's coming to mind as Mark talks about that, which is watching the work of the Chevra Kadisha really in the immediate aftermath.
The burial societies, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. And I shouldn't have been in there, but I was in the main sanctuary of the synagogue as the head of the FBI operation, was coordinating with Rabbi Wasserman and his particular burial society. And it was just unbelievably moving to me, kind of hearkening back to what Mark was saying before about how other times and places the uniformed people are the people working for the Tsar. And here it was the head of the FBI operation breaking down in tears, sobbing, and being held by the members of the Chevra Kadisha, which is a memory that just like will always stay with me.
That's something that's important to say as we conclude. I gather we have one last question, but before we do, that it's a very uplifting book in that sense. It's very beautiful. The stories are moving, and I think that they certainly bolster your faith in Jews and Judaism.
To that point, people kept saying this must be such a sad book to report, and I said, well, the stories are sad, and I often finish a day of reporting spent and have some tears, but it's actually a very hopeful book to write.
Okay, let's 1, 2, and then we're done. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm a 4th-year student at UCLA, a school that's often in the news for different anti-Semitic incidents. And I was wondering, how do you recommend we Jewish students stay optimistic when we're constantly dealing with anti-Semitism from our peers, from our professors, from our department chairs, and on social media?
Okay, and then Mike, one question far in the back. Right there. No, right there, standing up with the blue, and then I'm afraid that will have to be it.
So we're going to combine. We're going to
hear them first. We're going to combine these questions into one huge snowball of a question that will basically sum up the entire American Jewish experience. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm a sophomore in high school. My question has to do with Jewish identity. So I'm in my school's Jewish affinity group. It's a group of 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. And on our first meeting of the school year, our teacher, who is Israeli and American, asked us if we considered ourselves Jewish American or American Jews, and asked us why we identified ourselves as Jewish and why we decided that that was a reason to come to this affinity group. And all of us were like gobsmacked by these questions because I don't think any of us had ever really thought of it before. And in response, the faculty leader asked us to pose these same questions to adults who are Jewish in our lives and ask their takes on them because for some reason, young people just don't have the same kind of curiosity when it comes to their own religious identities. And especially in a city like Los Angeles. And I bring up the fact that we're in Los Angeles because my personal opinion would be that in a small, tight-knit Jewish community like Squirrel Hill, it would be a very different kind of response. And Jewish youth would have those answers. So I'm just wondering, why do you think we don't have those kinds of like curiosities and questions?
Two beautiful questions, and also, by the way, one of the rare and marvelous uses of gobsmacked in regular conversation. That's impressive. So what advice would you give to high school students, to college students about how to conceive of themselves and also how to deal with a sometimes hostile atmosphere?
I actually think these are questions. I'll give an answer, but actually, I'd love to end with. I think you and Barry think more about this, about those two questions.
You have 5 unbelievable children. some of whom I know and who are truly incredible.
Thank you.
There's no way that you're not thinking
Well,
about
so
this.
no, and one of them's a high school sophomore, so I'm right there with you. So let me just say this: I don't. It's not easy. I mean, I have talked to students. I'm not going to put my own family in the spotlight in this case, but I talked to a lot of young people in my reporting. I'm well aware of the anti-Semitism. I think it's a lot harder to be a Jew at a predominantly Gentile school now than when I was in high school from 1988 to 1992. I think that the Clinton years, the Bush 1 and Clinton years were low water marks for anti-Semitism in America. I think it was higher for a lot before then. I think it's been higher since. I think it was an awfully good time to be a teenage Jew. And ironically, I didn't care at all about my own Judaism at that point. I didn't know how good I had it or how interesting it was to be Jewish or what a gift it was. So I actually don't have a good recipe for how to deal with anti-Semites. Maybe that's what you'd expect from the person who wrote a book that really avoided the major anti-Semite in the room, the murderer. I don't know what to do about hateful, deluded people. In my own personal life, I try to avoid them because they're toxic and make me feel bad. I don't know how to avoid them on campus. I don't know how to avoid them as colleagues. I've had one or two, and I try not to talk to them. But that's not getting. I take your question so seriously. When you're in an environment that degrades who you are and your core identity, and you feel beleaguered, and how do you fight back? I don't have any good answer for that. And again, I think that may be something the two of you have thought about more. I will say this for myself. So let me speak for myself. And this is not prescriptive, which is that when I'm feeling like my own Jewish identity is most attenuated or makes the least amount of sense, when I've sort of lost purchase on why I do this, why I care, right? Because in America, most Jews, especially white passing Jews, are free to sort of pass into just Americanness, right? So why do I keep doing this? It's at exactly those moments that I feel like I probably should be doing something for someone else. In other words, it's not about me. It's about, is there somebody who needs a hospital visit or a phone call? Is there someone who needs a call on Friday night? Can I help make a minyan for mourners? Like, it's at those moments when I try to sort of evacuate my own ego. I don't do a good job of it, but it's when I feel like I probably should evacuate my own ego and say, how does the community need me? Because then at least I'm purposive. Like, when you're saying, well, how does the community need me? Then you're saying, how can I be useful in this world? How can I make what these hours that I was granted on this earth more useful? And I will say one of the tough things about college, I see this in Hillel somewhat, is there's so much, and I don't know about yours, often at Hillel's there's so much focus on like programming and trips and Greek life and whatever, that like you don't get out in the community and say like there's some elderly Jews who might need some help with something. And that at least regrounds you in sort of, why do we do this?
Barry?
Yeah, I think part of the answer comes in the father of the 8th grader. What's his name, David? Alan. In what Alan advised his daughter to do in the application to any number of fancy high schools that we could all name, which is to say, never erase your Judaism. I might even go further and say, maybe those high schools aren't for you, or maybe this particular campus isn't for you, if what it's asking of you is to erase fundamental parts of who you are. Now, there's a fine balance, and I'm not at UCLA, you are. And I'm not in the 8th grade or the 9th grade, your daughter will be. But I would only suggest that the right frame of mind for us is not and should never be, what does it take for us to fit in there? It's, can I be a part of a place that elevates me and my gifts and the unique, world-changing values that are encoded in Jewish history, in Judaism, in Zionism, and of all of the things that bring us to an event like this tonight. And so it's just a fundamental posture of Jewish pride and a refusal to self-abnegate or self-erase that is, I think, the beginning of the answer to this question. For me, I read this essay that I will recommend to everyone here, especially high school and college students, that I took the name for my book from it. I got his permission, and it was called How to Fight Anti-Semitism. It's written by, he's now an Israeli philosopher, he made Aliyah, and it's called How to Fight Anti-Semitism by Zev Magen, is his last name. And this was a well, it was before virality, but it was this essay that kind of went viral at Columbia before I got there. And he wrote it, I won't give it away, but in response to what he saw as the foolish mainstream Jewish communal response to the presence of a black, I think he was a Black Panther, Leonard Jeffries, but an anti-Semite on campus. And basically he characterized the mainstream communal Jewish response as holding up a sign saying, "Don't call me a pig. Don't call me a pig." And he said, why would we ever negotiate with people that call us pigs? The right response is not to stand in front of people who are fundamentally denying our dignity and our humanity. It's to go off and start a bonfire with the people, Jewish and non, who see us in our full humanity and see us for who we are. And I think that it's that shift in posture that is the thing that is most urgently needed in our community writ large at this moment.
Can I
please.
say one sentence?
Sure.
I'll just add to that. This tells you where sort of my mind is. If social media is depressing you or beleaguering you or gobsmacking you, you are allowed to get off social media. I did because it made me less happy. And you can too, actually. Life will go on. So that's one thing you can do.
And I'll close, since we got a beautiful particularist answer and a beautiful answer of Jewish pride and combativeness, I'll give you the Torah answer from this Shabbat, which is this Shabbat is Lech Lecha. God says to Abraham, Lech Lecha, go you. And unlike English, Hebrew has a singular you. Lecha is singular. It's not plural. But Abraham doesn't go alone. He goes with Sarah, and he goes with many others, Nifashot Asher Asu B'Charam, which the rabbis say are all the people he brought under the tent of Judaism. It's important to remember that you don't travel alone. Even if you feel alone at times, not only is there a worldwide Jewry with you, but all those people from Abraham onward, Moses, Isaiah, Ruth, Deborah, Maimonides, you travel in the great tradition of soul growth that the world has seen. And so you shouldn't ever feel like somebody's denigration can belittle this incredible tradition that gave all the great monotheistic faiths to the world. And I will leave you with my favorite line about anti-Semitism, which is from Maurice Samuel, who was a writer and a thinker and a translator. When someone asked him once why...
I love that you have a favorite line about anti-Semitism.
I do. It's my favorite. You're about to hear why.
You and the other rabbis are like, what's your favorite line about anti-Semitism?
Exactly. We have a whole group. Okay. It's on Twitter, so you wouldn't... But someone once said to Maurice Samuel, why does the world hate the Jews? And he said, no one loves their alarm clock. So if you're the alarm clock of the world, it's not always comfortable, but it's really important for the world to wake up. So thank you. Go buy a book.
Thank you.
Lord.